This video was long overdue. It's about time I tell you how to use en and i in French. You see, they are a part of almost every sentence we say in French, and yet we cannot translate them to other languages. How is that possible? Well, you see, every language has some grammatical aspects that we could get rid of, that we don't really need for the meaning. We use them by habit because it's the rule, but at the end of the day, if you don't use them, it's the same thing. For an example, I could give, she went there yesterday. If I oversimplify this, it would give something like, she yesterday there go, or she go there yesterday. You would understand what I mean. Like, the meaning is there, it's implied, but it's not grammatically correct. The same thing happens with en and i in French, except French is the overcomplicated language and all the other languages are oversimplified or bare minimum, right? And by the way, with the she go there yesterday, that's how Asian languages work for the most part, like Mandarin Chinese, for example. So let's take an example with English and French. If you say, have you heard about this in English? You could translate this to, tu as entendu parler de ça? T'as entendu parler de ça? And that would be correct, but that would not be the most natural way of saying things. The more natural way would be, tu en as entendu parler? Tu en as entendu parler? You see here, en replaces de ça. It's correct to say de ça, but it's more natural to say en, just like the previous example with English and the oversimplification of English with before or yesterday go and went. And I can give you another example with I this time. Okay, if you say, have you ever been there? In French, you could translate this with, tu es déjà allé là-bas? But that's not what most people will say spontaneously in French. They would most likely say something like, tu y es déjà allé, or faster, that would give something like, tu y es déjà allé. So that's the why. But what about the how? Well, on a fundamental level, en and i replace objects to avoid repetition. But what is an object? Let's take an example for that. The cow eats grass. Here, the cow is eating, so it's doing the action. The grass is eaten, so therefore it is the object. There are different types of objects like direct and indirect, but for the sake of this video and simplification, I'm just going to tell you when we use en and when we use i to replace an object. So to simplify a lot, we use i when it's about maybe a situation, a place, or when it's about verbs that are related to thinking, like j'y crois, I believe it, j'y pense, j'y réfléchis, all of that. It sounds complicated, but you already use i without knowing it maybe. When you say il y a, the i in there is what we're talking about. Il y a is there is. So it can both replace a place, or it can also refer to a situation. Il y a un malaise. There is awkwardness. And to simplify a lot, all the other objects will be replaced by en. So j'en veux, j'en écoute, j'en sais rien, j'en fais souvent, all of this. By the way, I'm using je, but it could be any pronoun. It doesn't matter. But if you really want to use them like native speakers do, there is a deeper layer to it that is a bit more complex. There is a slight connotation for en and i when we use them to replace the situation, to talk about the situation. You see, en has more of a passive connotation to it, more of a passive aspect, and i more of an active connotation. For example, if you translate, you think about it, you can translate this by t'en penses and t'y penses. Both of them are translated the same way, but they imply different things. T'en penses implies that you are thinking about something external, situation, but that doesn't concern you directly. So for example, If you are going to see a show with your friends, after the show, you might ask someone, or you might ask your friends, vous en avez pensé quoi? What do you think about the show? Or if something happens, or something external, something that you wouldn't have too much control over, you can say, t'en penses quoi? What do you think about it? But if you have more of an active position in it, if you're contemplating something, maybe considering doing something, then you can say, j'y pense, I'm thinking about it. Or j'y réfléchis, it's the same thing. But in that sense, you cannot ask, t'y penses quoi? There's no open question. It just doesn't exist. You would have to say, t'en penses quoi? If you say, j'y pense, it implies that you are just, like I said, contemplating, considering doing something. So you can say something like, j'en crois pas mes yeux, but you cannot say, j'en crois pas, because you're more active in that. J'en crois pas mes yeux means, I don't believe my eyes. So if you want to break it down, it could be something like, your eyes are sending signals to you, and then you're passive in that sense, so you don't believe your eyes. J'en crois pas mes yeux. But j'y crois pas, I don't believe it, you are the one doing the believing. Does that make sense? This little layer, this little distinction between the two really makes being very fluent in French a tough thing. So that was the why, then the how. What about the when? When do we use those mind tortures? It's a pretty easy question. Every time. Every time we are talking about something and we don't want to repeat the object over and over. Like, for example, if you and your friend are talking about Paris, you're not going to repeat Paris over and over. You're going to replace it by E, the same way you would replace Paris by there in English. But sometimes you can use E and là-bas. Là-bas would be the direct translation for there, just to make it a little bit clearer. Or if it's very clear what you're talking about, you will use them. For example, if you're at the dinner table with your family and then you're serving wine for everyone, you're not gonna repeat tu veux du vin over and over again. Instead, you will end up saying t'en veux to everyone. Or there's another situation where you might use them. It's when it's about the situation or sets of events. We have a lot of idioms that use en. For example, j'en peux plus. I can't do it anymore. It's too much for me. Or j'en ai ras-le-bol. It's like, I'm annoyed. J'en ai marre. Same thing. I'm annoyed. And we also use them to double the object. So it's not when it was previously stated before, but if you start off a conversation or if you bring a subject by saying, for example, t'en as déjà fait du vélo? Well, it just sounds better. It is a bit more comprehensible for us native speakers. Or t'en as déjà vu des dauphins? Or anything like this. Now, the last two questions. Who uses them and what can I do to start using them? Simply put, everyone that has a near native-like level in French. Because what makes a person sound like a native in French, apart from the accent, is whether or not they formulate good sentences that make sense and that are natural to us, and whether or not they're adapted to the culture. En and E are a big part of that. We use them all the time. They're so common. They're very natural for us to use. So I really encourage you to start using them. How can you go around it? What can you do for that? Well, watching this video and knowing about them were the first steps. Then you need to try to identify them when you hear them in conversation and try to understand what they can replace, what they mean. While you're working on the comprehensive side of it, you also need to try and go use them out there. Because you are going to make mistakes, you're going to fail using them, and misusing words is a very powerful thing to build a solid intuition around language. Because input is a word that is thrown around a lot, but sometimes it's just not everything. You also need some signals to build an intuition that are relevant, that you can only get when you're communicating with other human beings.